Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Today, we're discussing Lion L. Johnson's arrival to Deliverance, home of the Ravenguard, and Corvus Corax. Now unfortunately, there's no real need for a spoiler warning today, as much as I'd love to see these two Primarchs meeting and speaking in a novel, unfortunately we don't have that. Instead, this encounter is covered in an older edition of White Dwarf, issue 478 to be exact, which I referenced earlier in the week in regards to our which Primarch falls first in the scouring conversation. And although the Heresy series is technically over, and we'll get a few more Primarch conversations in the scouring series, I think we'd all love to get some Great Crusade era flashbacks and stories, where we can get to see more of the Primarchs interacting with each other, before it all fell to ruin. So fingers crossed we do get some of that down the line. However, back on topic, in issue 478, we received an article that covered the timeline of Lion L. Johnson's campaign of vengeance against the traitor homeworlds at the end of the Heresy. And there was a surprising entry within it, titled the Deliverance Conjunction, which told us of the Lion and his mighty war fleet arriving to the Ravenguard homeworld, where he found his brother Corax, along with Leman Russ and the remaining Space Wolves Legion, who Corax had saved from annihilation after Russ's duel with the War Master. And though it's not the longest passage in the world, it does enable us to learn a few interesting things regarding the relationship between the Raven and the Lion. The vast fleet of the First Legion Dark Angels reaches the moon of Deliverance in the Kievar system. There, in the fortress of the 19th Legion, Ravenguard, the Lion meets with his brother Primarchs Corvus Corax and Leman Russ. The Lion is quick to question Corax's absence from all the major fronts of the war since Istvan, but his ire is put to rest by Leman Russ, who points at the survival of his own legion as proof of the Ravenlord's continuous loyalty to the Emperor. Fully recovered from the wounds he suffered in the Trisolian system, Leman Russ declares that he and all 6th Legion warriors on Deliverance will join the Dark Angels in their crusade of obliteration, to appease the Lion's call to arms, and knowing well the fate that befalls those who do not demonstrate loyalty as the first Primarch expects it. Corax offers vast quantities of munitions and supplies from the forge veins of Kievar to the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, including thousands of newly created suits of Mark 6 Corvus pattern armour. Hesitant to commit any significant portion of his depleted legion to what he sees as an undertaking of excessive violence and needless waste, Corax assigns only a small expeditionary force of his Ravenguard to accompany the Dark Angels in the next stages of their campaign. Few in number, but bearing the experience of 1,000 battlefields between them, the Ravenguard depart Deliverance with orders to eliminate key enemy targets ahead of the Lion's onslaught, in order to save entire worlds from complete annihilation. Now, of course we do need to keep in mind, this is not from an official novel of the Horus Heresy series, and is just an article from White Dwarf. But it certainly gives off the impression that Corax and the Lion didn't have the best of relationships at all. If anything, giving off reminders and hallmarks of L. Johnson's earlier arrival to Ultramar and Macragge, there questioning Rabute, and here questioning Corax. In fact, it's an exact mirror of the situations really. And I do have to say, that's a bit rich on the part of Lion L. Johnson. As much as I love him, he's been busy wasting time with the folly of Imperium Secundus, a new Imperium, while the old one still stood. So who is he, really, to question Corax's loyalty? If anything, Corax has proved it far more than L. Johnson by having most of his legion annihilated at Istvan, and still fighting, returning to the throne world to gain the ability to rebuild his legion, to continue the fight. And you also have to ask, how much of the wider war would L. Johnson realistically have known anyway? Again, he's been stuck in Ultramar on the eastern fringe, cut off from the rest of the galaxy by the Ruin Storm, and before then, wasting months and years fighting Conrad and the Night Lords in the Framus campaign. So, in all likelihood, the Lion would be pretty blind to the wider war anyway, and I would imagine this was a pretty tense moment between the two, with Corax surely countering in kind, mentioning L. Johnson's lack of known action, and doubling down on his own sacrifice. Corax may be one of the lesser known Primarchs out there, lesser seen within the lore, but he's absolutely a top tier fighter. He wouldn't be backing down from L. Johnson, that is for sure, even in the state of mind he was in at the Heresy's end. However, it is interesting that L. Johnson is content with Russ's support for the Ravenlord here, revealing that of all his brothers, Russ's loyalty is one he apparently doesn't question. Which is pretty interesting considering at this point, their relationship is still supposed to be pretty bad. Their first meeting post-Julian. However, L. Johnson has witnessed the Curse of the Wolfen, and chose to keep that secret, never speaking of it. So I guess that does reveal, despite all his problems with Russ, he surprisingly trusted him to remain loyal. Now, I absolutely question the claims of Russ committing to the crusade because he knows the fate of those who don't demonstrate loyalty in L. Johnson's eyes, sounding like it was a press release by the 1st Legion PR department, and it's completely contradicted by Corax not doing it. But it makes sense that Russ would want to fight here, ever restless as he was. He wasn't able to simply sit things out, and his legion recovered about as good as possible by this point. He had to fight. However, we do get the further notion of the possible poor relations between Corax and L. Johnson again. Sure, Corax resupplies the Dark Angels, but he does that for the Wolves too. He would for any loyal legion. But as I said, he declines to join L. Johnson's crusade personally, and in any real force, giving only a small elite task force. And they are basically only there to prevent the Dark Angels, and arguably the Wolves too, from just wiping out worlds for the sake of it. And it states that Corax sees this campaign as a needless waste, and excessive, which, traitor homeworlds aside, you could probably argue, as the Imperium will need to be rebuilt after. And so, there's a definite clash of personalities going on here. The judging and rash L. Johnson, against the more thoughtful and reserved Ravenlord. And that could be quite surprising in a way, as both the Primarchs can be a little aloof, separate from their kin. So you would have thought that there would be a little common ground there. But for all intents and purposes, that doesn't appear to be the case. And so, I'd really love to see this moment covered in a novel or short story. See how this meeting truly went down and played out. What tensions or comradeship was found. And not only that, but a glimpse of the relationship prior to this within the Great Crusade as well. Perhaps an earlier meeting between Corax and the Lion that showed a lack of bond between them. Or even them getting on, and how it was the heresy that caused the tension. L. Johnson does mourn hearing of Corax's death after all. As much as the Lion can anyway. So it's definitely an interesting meeting, that is for sure. The dynamics of Primarch relationships at their best. The Raven, the Lion, and the Wolf. And so as always everyone, what do you think? What do you think of the frosty relationship between L. Johnson and the Ravenlord? Is this down entirely to the situation? Or do you think there's a bit of history there? Is L. Johnson in the right to question Corax here? Or is he being very hypocritical? Is it a bit of a joke considering L. Johnson's history with Imperium Secundus? Or does he have the right to question Corax? And are you surprised he takes Russ's word, given he surely wouldn't know much about Russ's actions save Prospero? Or was Prospero enough? And would you like to see more of this relationship explained in a flashback? The Raven and the Lion meeting face to face within the Crusade, conducting a campaign together. Do you think they would get along, or is there too much of a difference between them? As always everyone, leave your thoughts in the comments below. A huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. If you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too? But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.